Hello and welcome to our first episode of the First Mass Transport 85th Anniversary Commemoration podcast. There will be 3 episodes in this, and we also have 3 extra content episodes that you can go and listen to a little bit more. We also, don't forget, I've just finished Narvik as well, so all our extra content on Narvik is also there on our Patreon account. I will tell you a little bit more at the end of the podcast all about it and where to find us. But let's talk about the first transport. But we need to, of course, as always, give you a little bit of context when it comes down to when we talk about Auschwitz. We did do that on our last Auschwitz podcast, but we're going to do something a little bit different this time. I've got Zane with me and I have Chris with me. So, of course, our trio is continuing. And I think we're going to start with the invasion of Poland. And I'm making Zane do that one because considering his PhD is involving Poland, I think he should be able to do this off the top of his head. So let's talk about the invasion of Poland. And we're going to go through all of this and talk about how it all relates to the first transport. So kick us off, Zane.
Alrighty. So the military attaché that is in Warsaw sends a telegram to the War Office on the 31st of August, 1939 at roughly 7:05 Polish time. It has 3 important aspects. First, it says, quote, the Polish General Staff report that calculations estimate minimum number of German divisions now on Polish frontier as 42, maximum 54. Identifications, however, indicate a figure more in the neighborhood of 40, including reserve divisions whose headquarters have not been established, and mobile divisions not yet definitively located. Now, I want to pause here for a second and have you keep this in mind, these numbers of divisions being their estimations being maximum of 54, but roughly in the neighborhood of 40. You'll understand why a little bit later. Also, quote, 3 frontier incidents have been reported during the last 24 hours. The first of these took place at Valentinovo, northwest of Naklo. 15 Germans with a machine gun crossed the frontier, but were forced back by frontier guards. There were no casualties. At Viliun and near Rybnik, shots are fired across the frontier from Germany. Also, Polish mobilization is proceeding according to plan and smoothly, with the exception of certain incidents south of Lvov. Cases of sabotage of railway lines and telegraphic and telephonic wires have occurred, but it is not known whether they are due to German or Ukrainian activities. Furthermore, officially, it's there to celebrate the anniversary of the German victory in the Battle of Tannenberg in World War I. The aging German battleship Schleswig-Holstein arrives in the port of the free city of Danzig, in air quotes, on August 25th of 1939. Colorful flags would fly from the masts, and the men would stand at attention in their white dress uniforms, with their brass buttons shining in the late summer sun. However, the ship, it's not really there for that purpose. It's there for something else. Because unknown to the onlookers, there are over 200 Marines that are hidden below deck, preparing for a deliberate and unprovoked attack against Poland. Now, in the early morning hours of September 1st of 1939, the ship would quietly move the short distance from Danzig harbor to the Bend of Five Whistles across from the small Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte, and at 4:43 a.m. would open fire. Now, Hitler, of course, is determined to make it look as if the Poles are provoking the hostilities, and his SS are more than happy to oblige. They do this by staging numerous false flag operations and what they refer to as Polish provocations against Germans. Now, according to the testimony of Sturmbannführer Alfred Neujax, at Nuremberg, Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Müller ordered Operation Himmler to make the Poles appear to be the aggressors and to justify the coming war. The most infamous of these was the staged attack at a radio station in Gliwice on the German-Polish border on the night of August 31st, 1939. Local Silesian German farmer Franciszek Honiok, who was known to be sympathetic to Poland, was arrested by the Gestapo, drugged, and then shot. The Germans pretended that the Poles had stormed the station and had taken over, and Honyuk's body was left as evidence. It was a lie, but Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine was soon churning out stories around this particular attack. Now, by the morning of September 1st, 1939, Hitler is already using this incident to justify his invasion of Poland. Going back to those numbers of max 54, maybe 42 divisions, unfortunately, it was 62 divisions with more than 1,300 airplanes in support that would commence a coordinated assault across the German-Polish border. General George von Küchler's Third Army pushed in from East Prussia, while General Gunther von Klug's Fourth Army attacked the Polish corridor. There was a smaller attack by the Slovakian units in the south, and the Germans would hope that a fifth column of Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans, living in Polish territory who were sympathetic to the Third Reich, would aid the Nazi forces wherever possible. Now, Army Group South would drive deep into southern Poland from Silesia and Slovakia under Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt. General Johannes Blaskowitz's 8th Army went toward Łódź, General Wilhelm List's 14th Army to Krakow, while General Walter von Reichenau spearheaded the attack toward Warsaw. Now, the Germans had 1.5 million men for the attack, along with 2,750 tanks, 2,315 aircraft, and 9,000 guns. The Poles had an army of 1 million men, but many were unable to mobilize, and those who did had outdated equipment, and far less of it with just 4,300 guns, 210 tanks, 670 tankettes, and 800 aircraft. Now, the Polish plan was to put the bulk of their forces in the west to defend against German attacks and wait for the French and the British, with whom the Poles had signed a March 31st military alliance, to attack Germany from the west. The Poles did not believe that their allies would allow them to be overrun by the Germans without coming to their aid. Spoiler alert. However, by September 3rd, von Rundstedt's divisions had reached far into southern Poland. Von Klug was at the Vistula River, and von Reichenau was heading towards Kielce. Despite German propaganda to the contrary, Polish cavalry did not attack tanks with sabers on horseback. Instead, cavalry brigades carried bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank rifles. At the Battle of Mokra, the Wołyńska Cavalry Brigade destroyed over 50 German tanks and inflicted 800 casualties, in one of the only Polish victories of the war. The largest battle of the September campaign, the Battle of Bajura, saw the Poles attack a flank of the German forces moving toward the city and then throwing the Germans back about 20 kilometers. Even though that happened, by September 19th, the Poles had been encircled and 20,000 Polish soldiers had been killed. The surviving troops would make their way to Warsaw to continue fighting. While all of this is happening, over 150 towns and villages would be targeted in the first days with what is known as German mass terror bombings. The little town of Wilno was flattened on the 1st of September, and during the aerial defense of Warsaw between September 1st and the 6th, the Poles would down over 80 German bombers. So in retaliation, on September 10th, the Germans would carry out 17 consecutive bombing raids. At the same time, enemy tanks were closing in. About 150,000 civilians, terrified of the approaching army, would begin feverishly digging anti-tank ditches and creating barricades. On the 8th of September, German tanks encircled the Polish capital, and the attack began in the south. Now, they would push the panzers back, and the Germans would then return on the 9th. But the Poles would throw Molotov cocktails and set fuel on fire on the roads, destroying dozens of tanks, causing the Germans to retreat yet again. Now, approximately 140,000 poorly armed Polish soldiers defended Warsaw against about 175,000 Germans, armed with 1,000 artillery pieces and 1,000 aircraft. On the 15th of September, the Warsaw garrison repelled 3 major attacks. So a frustrated Hitler would declare on September 25th that he wanted the immediate surrender of Warsaw. So some 560 tons of bombs would be dropped on that same day, along with 72 tons of firebombs. However, despite their valiant fight against the Germans, any chance of the Poles holding out would be dashed on the September 17th, when Stalin would invade the part of Poland granted to him under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Compact. The Soviets attacked with over 450,000 troops, 4,736 tanks, and 3,300 aircraft. Now, the Polish army was already weakened, and plans to mount a defense in the south at the Romanian bridgehead were now obsolete. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th with a final death toll of over 20,000 civilians. Fighting continued as Germans and Soviets squashed final pockets of resistance, but on October 6th, following the Polish defeat at the Battle of Kosh, German and Soviet forces gained full control over the battered country. And although Poland never formally surrendered, this marked the end of the Second Polish Republic. Polish dream of independence, which had appeared so full of promise in 1918, had unfortunately come to an end.
As the dream of an independent Poland comes to an end, the terror begins. And in fact, as Zane was saying, terror attack on the civilians by the German invader starts pretty much on the first day with the bombing of Wielun, which was a settlement which had absolutely no military significance or industrial plants, and it was just targeted because they could, and the hospital had a big red cross on the roof, so it was an easy bombing target. This continues with the invasion. German troops carried out acts of reprisal or just execution because they could. No trials, just straightforward murder, such as Bloody Sunday, Bydgoszcz. Once Poland's occupied, it's split in two. So you've got the German half and the Soviet half, and then the Germans divide it in two again. You have part of it incorporated directly into the Third Reich, such as Katowice and Poznan, and then you get what's known as the General Government. And the head of the General Government was Hans Frank. He was Hitler's lawyer, and he made the famous Wawel Castle his home and office at the same time. So in the territories that are incorporated into the Third Reich, you get a new action that's created, the Intelligenz Action. This is an action of extermination against the Polish intelligentsia. These are, I mean, you'd think immediately, oh, that's like university doctors, people like musicians. It's anyone that has a white collar job. So mayors, chief of police, anyone that would be normally tell people how to run the country, because the Germans believe if you cleanse that out, then you have people who wouldn't be able to work things out on their own. Kind of as the German system is, you always follow orders. Well, if there's no one giving the orders in Poland, then the populace won't know what to do. So they believed in cleansing it straight away. The second action which takes place in the General Government is Action AB. This is, if you want to hear it in German, Außerordentliche Befreundungsaktion, or the Extraordinary Pacification Action. This is a preventative measure to destroy any anticipated resistance. And during a meeting with representatives of the police apparatus on the 30th of May 1940, Hans Frank speaks about AB action and states that this is the aim. The accelerated liquidation of most of the rebellious resistance, politicians, and other politically suspect individuals, as well as a simultaneous end to traditional Polish criminality. I openly admit that as a result, several thousand Poles will have to part with their lives, mainly from the ideological spheres of Polish leaders. So before this be various different actions against various different groups of intelligentsia. For example, in November 1939 with the Sonderaktion Krakow, Germans arrest 183 professors at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Many of them were older men who were sent to Sachsenhausen, where most of them didn't survive. The lecturers, university, were invited by the German occupation authorities to a meeting, and the purpose of which was to discuss the Third Reich's plan for higher education. They came to the lecture voluntarily, willingly, hoping that the Germans would allow the university to continue operating. The invitation turns out to be a trick. The gathered scholars are arrested and informed that they would be transported to a camp. No one was allowed to say a word of protest. The entire operation was carried out in a very brutal manner. The detained people were, as I said, often elderly, were kicked and slapped. Those arrested were transported to a prison, Roswaf, and then to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. After a wave of international protest and the personal intervention of, strangely, Benito Mussolini, the leader of fascist Italy in 1914, the lecturers over the age of 40 were released. By the end of 1941, the remaining scientists who managed to survive were released. Unfortunately, many scholars died in Sachsenhausen and the other camps. Some died immediately after liberation due to exhaustion and disease suffered during their captivity. Mass executions, which were part of Action AB, continued at Palmyra as a prime example. Palmyra is a small village in Campinos Forest, northeast of Warsaw. The first executions began in December 1939 and carried on through till July 1941. The execution site was then covered up and a different execution site was picked for further operations. And last year, Alina took me down there to visit the mass graves in the museum. It's really quite haunting. The victims were lawyers and representatives of the legal professions, engineers, artists, teachers, doctors, soldiers, athletes, social and political activists, and officials, including the Marshal of Sejm and MPs. We're going to talk a bit about those in our extra content. The terror came in other forms as well, other than mass execution. There are laws that were enacted against the Polish Jewish population. They're not allowed to enter cafes or bars, parks, take public transport, and eventually were locked behind the walls of the ghettos. The first ghetto to open in occupied Poland was in
Piotrków Trybunalski.
In October 1939. The Warsaw Ghetto would close in gates in October 1940. There's also regular roundups where people would fear to leave their homes because they might get caught up in a roundup. The Germans, they weren't particularly picky. They just round up a group of civilians, and if you just happen to be in the right area at the wrong time, everyone who's then caught would be arrested and taken away, possibly never to be seen again. A great example of this sort of terror is a comparison between France and Poland and the terror of the 18th century, as well as in France during the Second World War occupation, where 100 people were caught up in a roundup. Out of the 100 people arrested, there might be a Jew or a few resistance members, maybe an undesirable, let's say 10 people. The other 90 would be released. In Poland, it would be the opposite. Out of the 100 people that were rounded up, 90 would be sent to prison and later either sent to a concentration camp or forced labor or executed. Maybe if they were lucky, those other 10 people would be released. A policing hour was introduced, which begins at 7 p.m. till 5 a.m., so there's a curfew. Later, this is pushed back to 8 p.m. and then 9 p.m. And Alina's got a family story about this, but we'll save that for the extra content. Nur für Deutsche Poles are not allowed to sit in certain areas of trams or on park benches into certain establishments. Jews, on the other hand, were absolutely forbidden.
Well, that sets the scene for what is happening in Poland during the occupation. It is absolutely horrific. It's terrible. And Poland is the only country that undergoes such harsh laws under German occupation. But I'm going to talk to you about reasons why people were arrested, apart from roundups, apart from, the usual thing that Chris has just gone through. People were arrested, especially these people that we're going to be talking about, these 728 men, actually, not people, men. So why these men were arrested, and boys, lots of young boys. We'll talk about that in another episode, actually, more about the dynamics and who's involved in this. So we've got what were called tourists. Now, you could imagine a tourist as like, we've all been tourists, all our listeners, clearly you've all been tourists. You've all gone around and, looked around at a building or walked through the old town of a city. No, that's not what we're going to talk about. Tourists, this is what the Germans called Poles who were trying to escape Poland. As the army was losing in Poland, a lot of people left or evacuated out towards Hungary and Romania and things like that. And then the people left behind also wanted to do that, especially young people. They wanted not to be under occupation. They wanted to get out of Poland and fight for their country, fight with the rest of the army. What they would do is they would cross the border into Slovakia and then slowly but surely move their way into Hungary. Now, the problem here is I'm sorry if there's any Slovaks listening, but facts are facts. Unfortunately, a lot of the Slovaks were more or less working with the Germans at this point. They had decided that it's better to be on their side rather than, standing for the Poles, because otherwise what's going to happen to them is going to happen. What's happening to the Poles is going to happen to them. If any Poles were caught, they would obviously go to a Slovak prison and then obviously be transferred to the Gestapo. The Gestapo are taken back to Poland, put them in a prison, and then we are where we are. Those people that are escaping are called as tourists, and a lot of our first transport members were, quote, tourists. That's what they were. They were trying to escape, but they just didn't make it. There is Zbigniew Dredecki is one of them, actually. So him and his brother get caught as well as Kazimierz Albin and his brother. They also get caught. They get put into a prison, tortured, and then sent to eternal prison, which we'll talk about in a second. But also Zbigniew Turecki's other brother, because there was three of them, he actually takes a different escape route. And he goes, I don't even know how he does it. Please do not ask me, because Zbigniew Turecki doesn't write about it in his memoirs and his testimony and all the various different documents. And he's left quite a lot of paperwork. He doesn't actually talk about how his brother did it, but he ended up going through Russia apparently, and somehow ended up in Great Britain. So there are various other different routes. You could also go through the Baltics into Finland. That was another route out. Some people going in through Japan, lots of various different things, but the ones going through Slovakia were called tourists, right? Okay, so that's number one. Number two were intelligentsia. Of course, Action AB, there were a lot of people that were arrested and put into prisons, and they were just part of the intelligentsia. So simple, easy, we know what that is. They were part of that arrest. Number three, resistance members. So if you were part of the resistance, because being the resistance is a big no-no. So the Union of Armed Struggle, the ZWZ in Polish, Związek Walki Zbrojnej, they start, this is what the AK eventually becomes, the Home Army becomes. They begin work literally from day one. And they start bringing in especially a lot of young people. And one of them, Stanisław Białaś, he is one of my favorite human beings. He is with a group of his friends, including one of his Jewish friends. They all join this resistance movement, and they just get caught out. Unfortunately, and this is a repetitive story you'll hear quite a lot in some of these testimonies, those that were arrested because they were part of the resistance or were going to join the resistance or were participating in some form of resistance, right? So in that sort of category, they were given up by fellow Pole. And this is, like I said, a story that we'll hear quite a lot, especially if you listen to me jabber on about Polish history. It does happen. And, I can't say why these people gave up their friends. I don't know. We'd have to ask them. But it's not a black and white situation. It's not so simple as to say, he gave them up because he was working for the Germans. Well, how do we not know that his family wasn't threatened, or he wasn't threatened, or he wasn't tortured? Not that I'm making excuses, but we just got to think a little bit outside of the box when we're talking about this sort of subject. Or maybe he just was a horrible human being. So there's also that possibility. We have three reasons why people were arrested: tourists, intelligentsia, and resistance members. Now, before we actually get to the concentration camp system moment, we need to talk about the reasons for concentration camps. Why are concentration camps here? Why are these people being sent to a concentration camp? And Zane is going to tell us all about, the beginnings all the way through. Obviously, we're not going to sit here for 20 minutes talking about that, but Zane's still going to tell us all about it.
So the first concentration camp opens in March of 1933. It opens at Dachau, just outside of Munich. Now, this particular camp was for Hitler's political opponents, which would wear red triangles. Now, smaller concentration camps would also be created in basements of houses, so they didn't have to be as large or on the scale as the Dachau. They just had to be able to house prisoners. Now, the function of the concentration camp, that's going to change over the next 8 years. For example, once all of Hitler's political opponents have been dealt with, the Germans would then begin targeting other undesirable people. For example, the asocials. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with asocials, it's a term that is used by the Nazis to describe a group of people that they would categorize together as not conforming to social norms. And these would include individuals like beggars, those that were alcoholics, maybe drug addicts, prostitutes, and of course, pacifists, or anyone that really believed war is unjustified. Now, they would be marked with a black triangle. And then, of course, they would also start targeting homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, criminals. But here's where it gets slightly tricky in a way, is that criminals would still also be kept in prisons. They would only really be sent to concentration camps if it was for less serious offenses. Now, all of these people, all of these categories, these are basically individuals that were not wanted in what would be the perfect society that Hitler would be creating or is trying to create with his pure Aryan race. And the next time that the concentration camp system is going to be changed is going to happen in 1935. And this is really where it begins to make use of the prisoners that are within these camps. I mean, what is the point, really, if they're all just sitting around when you could put them to some sort of use? And so, just outside of Sachsenhausen, for example, they built a brick factory where prisoners were put to use in making bricks for the Third Reich. Now, this is the type of thing that we're going to be seeing repeat itself throughout all of the different concentration camps in the system. Now, the next stage is going to be when Mauthausen is built in Austria. Now, this would be the first time that foreign prisoners would be brought into the concentration camp system. Until this point, it was strictly German political prisoners or other members of society deemed unworthy. Now, this camp would become extremely infamous for its quarries and the stairs that these prisoners would have to carry stones up to the top. It would be referred to as the Stairs of Death. And in its subcamps, Gassen 1, 2, and 3, over 30,000 Poles would lose their lives through heavy forced labor. Now, the final stage in this process would be Auschwitz. It, of course, began as a concentration camp and eventually would evolve over time into a hybrid of both a concentration camp and a death camp. Now, Poles were started to be deported into the concentration camp system in 1939, but there were not many that would be sent out to Germany. Several hundred would be sent to Sachsenhausen, and 2,198 to Buchenwald. The largest movement of Poles to concentration camps is going to begin in April of 1940. The first transport was on the 10th of April, where 1,200 prisoners were sent to Sachsenhausen from the town of Trun. The second was on the 15th of April to Dachau, where 760 prisoners from Lublin, Kielce, Krakow, and Poznan. And this would continue, and Poles would end up dominating the prison population in many of these camps. So much so that 21,377 Poles would be sent to Dachau by the end of 1940.
Well, that gives me an intro to talk about Auschwitz. So thank you for that, Zane, because you've set a really good scene for me here, talking about Poles being moved to concentration camps. Now, the problem in Poland is that prisons have started to become overcrowded. And you're looking at going into a cell, let's say 4-man cell, you've got 10, 15 people being kept in a 4-man cell. So the prison directors they're going crazy at this point. They're writing back to the Third Reich and to the government. They're like saying, right, listen, this is the situation. We have nowhere to put these people, right? The prisons are overflowing. You keep arresting people, Action A, B, all the various other, our tourist friends, for example. We've got nowhere to put these people. It's becoming too overcrowded. We can't feed them. We can't do anything. Right. So, of course, they begin to start deporting them to places like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. But the problem that they find now, these concentration camps are not set up for the mass influx of prisoners that they're going to be receiving. Dachau in itself, even though they're accepting people in April, they have nowhere to put them. They've got no barracks to house them. They've got nothing. They're just completely unprepared. So how do we solve this issue? Well, they need to put a concentration camp in occupied Poland, which makes it so much easier for them to be able to transport people from the general government, and they haven't got that very far to go, and then they're just thrown into this concentration camp, and thank you very much, goodbye. So they make a decision in January of 1940 because these prison officials, they're going mental already by December of 1939. They just will not let go. Our lovely head of inspectors, Gluck, looks for various different locations for this concentration camp in January of 1940. So first of all, he heads to Gliwice, or Gleiwitz, which is what it's known at the time. Gleiwitz actually ends up being one of the Auschwitz subcamps eventually. You have Gleiwitz 1, 2, and 3 head to, when Chris and I were talking about it for the liberation of Auschwitz, we talked more about those subcamps and what they do and the evacuation process and everything else and who was there. Gleiwitz. Unfortunately, the location just isn't what they're looking for. So finally, they come across barracks, basically old barracks that have been partially bombed, destroyed because of the invasion of 1939. And these barracks have stood there for, since the Russian occupation in the early 1900s. So there's infrastructure already there. So all they have to do realistically is kind of do a little bit of repairing, chuck a little bit of, of barbed wire around it, and they can start off with that, because then they've got laborers to go in and start fixing this place up and start building it to, what it eventually would be. So that's option number one, that this place has stood there for already 30, 40 years. Secondly, the location. It is pretty isolated, because once you get rid of all the civilians, you're surrounded by two rivers. You're surrounded by the Wisła and you're surrounded by the Soa rivers. So those two rivers, if you actually look at it on a map, and we will pop a map up on our Patreon account so people can see what I mean when I refer to it surrounded by two rivers, which isolates it completely. So that's not reason number two. And reason number three is there's existing train lines. And this goes back all the way to the partition period. And people are like, well, why do you have to go all the way back to the partition period? Well, in the partition period, the town of Oświęcim, which is where Auschwitz is located, the town of Oświęcim was the hub for being able to move around the world. Meaning, there were a lot of offices, travel offices that were set up, and a lot of people would come to Oświęcim to buy their ticket to America, to buy their ticket to Australia, to buy their ticket to England, whatever the way it was. And all of these train lines, this large train infrastructure was built all the way going to Oświęcim, which in itself is perfect, because they can therefore bring lots of prisoners from all around the country, all around Europe, to this one little town, Oświęcim. So that's number three of why this place is chosen. Huss arrives, so he's the new concentration camp commander. He arrives in April of 1940. He finds this place a mess. As I've mentioned, parts of it have been bombed. There's nothing that he can use. So, for example, he now has to start scrounging. He has to go outside of Oświęcim into places like Bielsko, Biała, Katowice to be able to even find barbed wire for him to be able to use. And this is going to make a little bit more sense as we continue going through this, especially in tomorrow's episode where we talk about the arrival of the first mass transport, because they realistically can't go into the camp just yet because it's just not ready. And these prisoners that we're going to talk about, 728 prisoners that are chosen from Tarnów prison, and they're the ones that will be the first prisoners. Take that with a pinch of salt, because we will talk about the people who arrived just before the first mass transport prisoners. We will talk more about that in our extra content, and we'll talk about more about that tomorrow. Let's talk more about their experience, which brings us to Chris. Talk us through Tarnów prison. Talk us through where these 728 men are. Talk us through the conditions. Talk us through, what is happening to them.
Yeah, well, some of these prisoners who end up on the first transport, they've already been in prison since the early days of the occupation, say November to December 1939. Others are being brought in from other prisons in the first few weeks leading up to the first transport. It's still in the town of Tarnów, and you can visit it. It hasn't changed that much. Prisons don't tend to. The conditions in the prison are dire, to be fair. Some of the prisoners would be crammed into a small cell where they would have no room to sleep. Others would be lucky if they had any bunks in them to sleep on. Others were sleeping on the floor. They couldn't wash. Many of them hadn't bathed in 6 months. They would try to keep themselves clean in whatever little water they managed to get hold of. Food rations are incredibly low. Sometimes they would get lucky, and one of the Polish guards was able to sneak in some loaves of bread, which they would then share among the prisoners in the cells. A lot of the time, prisoners are just left to starve in their cells. It's that sort of German natural wastage thing. Some of the guards would risk their lives to help prisoners, for example, sending letters to their loved ones and to let them know that they were all right or where they were. Prisoners are not allowed communication. with the outside world. The guards would also bring in food and provide them with information on the current political news and what's going on in the occupied area. They would still be hopeful that the French and the British would come to free them, and that the Allied invasion of Germany would soon see Poland free again. As Zane said, spoilers. Boredom is is at its highest. There's literally nothing you can do in standing room only cells. Kazimierz Albin said, "Weakened by hunger, we would lie motionless on our bunks for hours, our eyes fixed on a single point on the ceiling, seemingly without a thought in our heads. Yet what does a prisoner not dream of in such times?" His favourite way to pass the time was to kill lice, because not only was it, in a way, to kill the boredom, but it also gave the prisoners relief from being eaten alive by the bugs living in their clothes and in their bedding. Prisoners would also pass the time by walking round their cells, but they could not look out of the windows, because if they did, a shot would ring out from a guard tower and hit the frame of the window. It was as a warning shot. The windows are not covered from the outside with planks of wood yet, and the prisoners could see out into the outside world, which is, again, strictly forbidden. The windows were covered from the outside with planks of wood, yet the prisoners could still sort of see out into the outside world through gaps, which is obviously strictly forbidden. Newly arrived prisoners that would end up on this first transport from the other prisons did not undergo any interrogations, because they were interrogated in their former prisons. If Tarnov was your first point of call, then you're most likely going to be interrogated and tortured for various information. Sitting in their cells, the prisoners had no idea what was coming next. It was which psychologically affected them with anxiety of the unknown. Some of the prisoners believed that they couldn't survive anything worse, but where they're heading would be a lot worse, and only 40% of this transport would survive the war. Prisoners would communicate with each other through Morse code by tapping on the pipes, and on the 12th of June, a message was passed around the prison that they were leaving tomorrow. The guards confirmed it on the following day, and in the late afternoon, early evening of the 13th of June, the cells of Tarnov prison were emptied. The Germans would enter the cells of the prisoners and chase them into the courtyard. From the courtyard, the prisoners were either marched or driven in trucks to the local male Jewish baths.
We have started the narrative of the first transport. Today is the 13th of June. We've set the context. We are now in the prison, leaving the prison to the Jewish male baths, which are not far away from the prison. And they're arriving to the bathhouse. Now, when they arrived to this bathhouse, they were sent in small groups to be able to bathe, but a lot of the prisoners found it really dirty in there. It was chaotic. There were half-naked men searching for their clothing. The floors were filthy. You've got to remember, what Chris has literally just told us is that these men, or most of them, hadn't bathed for nearly 6 months. And of course, their clothing is going to be filthy. However much they're going to have a bath, that's great, amazing. You get to have a shower and you get to have a bath, but your clothing is still absolutely filthy. And the problem is, if you're going to leave your clothing and then another 100 men are going to come in behind you and they're also going to take off their clothing, you're not going to be able to find your clothing amongst piles and piles of other clothing. So of course it was just chaotic. It was an insane moment. Their personal effects are also given back. This gives you food for thought. Are they going to be released? I mean, obviously, we know this. They're not going to get released. They're going to go to Auschwitz. We know that. They don't know this. And the same thing happens in places like Palmyra. So before they take you for the execution site, they will give you your personal effects back, which is how a lot of people were identified in the mass graves. In this context, do you think, well, they probably thought the same thing. They're getting their personal effects back. They're going home. The Red Cross then turns up. The women, and this is something that's relived in the testimonies all the time, that the Red Cross gives out food, and they give out a lot of food. So much food that they literally gorge themselves. A lot of these men haven't eaten properly for months. Some of them have been imprisoned since September, October, November, December of 1939. That's months of starvation. But they still gorge themselves on that food. And they remember in those testimonies where they say that this was the most amazing soup and the most amazing bread they've ever eaten in their lives. It's something that is stuck in their memory. They're also given half a loaf of bread. This half of loaf of bread is supposed to be for the journey. Most of them, unfortunately, they ate it immediately. Just before I move on, let's have a listen to Kazimierz Szczerbowski and his testimony.
We had the opportunity to meet friends from other cells and compare our observation and experiences. We were all pretty much in agreement about tomorrow. Tomorrow, freedom awaited us. It was going to happen because we all wanted to. Because why were we in the bathhouse? Why give us our belongings back? Wasn't it because they were sending us home relatively clean and lice free? While chatting about our freedom, we fell asleep, lying down wherever we could. There was even enough space.
It's a very interesting testimony because he more or less repeats what I just said a few moments ago, that they believed that they were going home, that they believed that they were going to go back to their families, they were going to have a bath and have their personal effects back. But unfortunately, we know that they don't. They end up in Auschwitz, which leaves us to the end of this day. So we will stop more or less here and we will come back to the following day, what happens actually on the 14th of June, which is commemorated as the day of the first transports. It's also commemorated as the National Day of Remembrance for German victims. It's a Polish National Remembrance Day, and it's in honour of the first transport that arrived in Auschwitz on the 14th of June of 1940. So if you have liked this podcast and podcast series, then please head to our Patreon account. You can find us on Moments in Time World War II edition on Patreon. And thank you so much to everybody for your support. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for the Warsaw Uprising series, the Auschwitz Liberation series, Narvik, the podcasts in between, now this one. And we will see you over our Patreon, and we will also see you tomorrow. So thank you very much.